Well, last Sunday we kicked off Unity Month in honor of our co-founders Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, who happen to both have been born during the month of August. And we talked a little bit about how they gave us this wonderful, wonderful gift of what I like to call radical freedom. In Unity, we have a lot of freedom. Those who attend a Unity Center on a regular basis know that we have no fixed creed. We have no formal catechism that people have to recite. Anyone come from a background where you have to learn a catechism and then be able to repeat it back to your religious education teachers, and you weren't allowed to change a single word. I mean, that was just absolutely forbidden. Well, we got none of that here. Nothing like that here. No statement of faith. There's no such thing as an office of orthodoxy in Unity. Unity Worldwide Ministries does not have some kind of an office that tries to root out heresy or force our ministers or our spiritual leaders to conform to a certain agenda or say certain things, and that's by design. That was intentional. Charles Fillmore wrote something that we shared last week that he wrote back in 1918 talking about unity, and this is what he said about unity. He said it is in this respect totally different from the other religious systems of the world, because it does not in any respect rest its authority upon revelation. It has no dogmas nor creeds, nor are its students, and that would be all of us here, nor are its students expected to believe anything that they cannot logically demonstrate to be true. It's a lot of freedom. That's very unstructured, sounds very unstructured, and I have to confess that at least at some Unity centers, it means that there are some really bizarre and cringeworthy stuff that's being promoted in the name of unity, and I guess that's the price that we pay for that freedom. That kind of freedom does not mean that anything and everything goes, because we have our own tradition. We have our own history that guides us, that we draw from. But the big difference is that we study that history, we study that tradition, and we question it. And we have to change it sometimes. The Fillmores wanted us to use reason and logic to test an idea instead of carving it into stone and then bowing down to it. That's what many people think of when they hear the word religion, carving something into stone and worshiping it like an idol. Blind faith, which is why there's this increasing number of people, I like to talk about this every so often, this increasing number of people who call themselves spiritual but not religious. I understand where they're coming from, but that's not one of my favorite descriptions, because what they often mean by spiritual but not religious is that they don't want any kind of structure. They swing in the total opposite direction, the opposite extreme, really. Well, now we're starting to hear about some folks who call themselves spiritual and religious. I like that a little better. A few years ago, Diana Butler Bass, she wrote this article here she wrote an online article called The End of Church. And she's the author of something like 8 books on religion in America, so she's what you might call an expert on these things. She studies the spiritual but not religious phenomenon, and this is what she has to say about spiritual and religious. This is her description. She says, spiritual and religious expresses a grassroots desire for new kinds of faith communities, where institutional structures do not inhibit or impede one's relationship with God or neighbor. Americans are searching for churches and temples and synagogues and mosques, and I would add to that places that aren't even called churches, synagogues, temples, and mosques. Places that you might call a center. That's another term for it. They're looking for something that is not caught up in political intrigue, rigid rules and prohibitions, institutional maintenance, unresponsive authorities, and inflexible dogma, but instead offer pathways of life-giving spiritual experience, connection, meaning, vocation, and doing justice in the world. Amen. That's a shift. So, in other words, What these folks want is a welcoming spiritual community, advancing a positive message that teaches people of all ages and faiths how to thrive in a changing world so that we can co-create a world that works for all. There you go, right? Hey, we're over here. We're over here. You know, we have enough structure to hold things together. You got to have that structure to hold things together, to give us a logical framework. And then we get to question it, make changes, help it evolve and be more responsive to what we see going on in the world, because things change. What worked 20 years ago may not necessarily work today. So unity is spiritual, and we have a structure. There are books that people can read and study. There are ideas that they can take or not. There are places that people can go to find like-minded people at unity centers all around the United States if they want to talk about these ideas and explore. And despite the fact that we have no statement of faith and no catechism, there are these ideas and core values that form the foundation of what we do. And again, we want them to evolve. 20 years ago, you all know about our 5 unity principles. Most of you who have been around have heard about the 5 unity principles. You would think they were something that has been with us since the very beginning. They've only been around for about 20 years or so, maybe 24 years now. I don't have the exact date. Not that long ago. Not that long ago. About 20 or some years ago, an attempt was made to summarize unity teachings for an article that was appearing in the Daily Word magazine. And Connie Fillmore Bozzi, who is a unity minister and the great-granddaughter of our co-founder, she took on the task. And she's the one that formulated the 5 principles that she believed were the basis for the things that we teach. And this is what I would call the classic way of wording them. This is the way that she worded them. And we've given them to you in the handout so you can take them home with you and take a look at them. Principle number 1, God is absolute good everywhere present. Number 2, human beings have a spark of divinity within them, the Christ spirit within. Their very essence is of God, and therefore they are also inherently good. Number 3, human beings create their experiences by the activity of their thinking. Everything in the manifest realm has its beginning in thought. And then number 4, prayer is creative thinking that heightens the connection with God mind and therefore brings forth wisdom, healing, prosperity, and everything good. And finally, the 5th principle, knowing and understanding the laws of life, also called truth, are not enough. A person must also live the truth that he or she knows. That's it. 5 simple statements, and if you look at the websites for different unity centers, including our own, you will notice that the wording of these principles is often changed, and yet the essence pretty much remains the same. That's evolution at work. Even though our basic principles aren't treated as a creed or a statement of faith, there is an essence of truth to them, and it's been my experience over the years of doing this that people who find us and stick around usually resonate with these principles at some level. And that's all because they are experiential. They're meant to be worked with, not just looked at and worshipped. Whatever teaching is being advanced, no one is required to accept it based on a claim of invisible or supernatural authority. We're empowered to look for the evidence that a teaching or principle is practical. We can see it working in real life, repeatedly and reliably. We see it working in our lives. That's what it's all about. So, I've given you a few questions in your handout, things we might want to be thinking about when it comes to the original version of these principles. So, for example, take a look at the first principle here. God, absolute good, everywhere present. Well, the question that comes up for me is, does that mean that everything is good? Oh boy. Maybe good isn't the best choice of words going forward. What's the next step in the evolution of that idea? We get to decide. Or how about the next one, the spark of divinity? If everyone has the spark of divinity, as the second principle says, then why don't people behave more divinely? Is it free will? And everybody likes to say, yeah, it's all because of free will. Or Are we genetically, culturally, and environmentally determined to do some of the things that we do? How far does free will go? There is a lot of debate going on right now about whether human beings truly have what we assume to be free will. A very interesting debate. I've been reading a lot about it lately. I don't hear any Unity folks getting into the discussion, and I think it's about time that we do, lest we be left behind as these important issues are fleshed out and put out there. Our third principle. Our third principle is sometimes used by people to claim that, poof, we create our own reality. Quantum physics, hey, doesn't work that way. I don't think we're that powerful. But what does it mean? Maybe it means something else. Are my thoughts the cause of all the good and the bad things that happen to me? Or do we need to look more deeply? And then we have our fourth principle, the one that uses the word prayer. And we know this, prayer means a lot of different things to different people. What are we to make of that study back in 2006, which showed that people who were being prayed for had a higher incidence of complications after surgery? Does that mean that prayer doesn't work? Or is the problem with our basic understanding of what prayer is? And what do we do about that? It's an invitation to take it deeper. And finally, our fifth principle. Really straightforward, right? Living the truth, putting it into action. Nothing controversial here, but how do we do that? How do we strike a balance between introspection and action? Between being and doing? We've all heard about the power of now, just resting in the moment and the power of now, but what are we supposed to do about tomorrow? And doesn't the past have some important things to teach us? Again, balance. So what we're going to find is that these principles are a starting point. They're designed to point us in a certain direction and get us to start asking some basic and important questions. It's like the old story from Zen Buddhism about a master teacher coming along and points to the moon, shows the student, there's the moon. And instead of the student making an effort to look where the teacher is pointing, the student starts worshiping the teacher's finger. The master points to the moon and the student worships the finger. Here's the moral of that old Zen story. It says this, it says, truth has nothing to do with words. Truth can be likened to the bright moon in the sky. Words, in this case, can be likened to a finger. The finger can point to the moon's location. However, the finger is not the moon. To look at the moon, it is necessary to gaze beyond the finger, right? For sure. We don't want to be that guy, the one worshiping the finger. A principle, a teaching, an idea, it needs to be living and breathing in order to lead to truth. We're the ones who have to do the work. A principle invites participation. It invites a living relationship. So by now, probably you've noticed that the way we state our 5 principles here at Unity of Auburn is a bit different from the original version. We've got them posted in a frame right outside the entryway. And they're different because, as I just said, we're engaged in a dynamic evolutionary process. And so for the next couple of Sundays here, we're going to delve into those questions that I raised earlier and maybe arrive at some clarity about our 5 principles and see how they're evolving. So we've got a little time left today, so let's just jump into the first principle. Okay? The original wording, God is absolute good everywhere present. Okay, at one time, I can really see how it was useful and necessary to start using the word good in connection with God. Because for many religious people, God was a vengeful, nasty, wrathful, jealous entity who hated stuff and would not hesitate to cast a person into the lake of fire, whatever you want to call it, if they didn't get their theology right. When you call God absolute good, you are setting up a stark contrast to that old, worn out, call it orthodox way of looking at God. That's a good thing to do. Sometimes you've got to get people's attention. You've got to raise that kind of contrast. Tell the world that there is another way of looking at the nature of God. No wrath, no punishment, just good. And the other thing that that principle says is that if God is absolute good everywhere present, then that means that there's no room for you-know-who. And I don't mean Voldemort. Unity was once regarded as very radical because we do not, and we have never believed in the existence of Satan or the devil or demons or any kind of evil entity by any name. I'm happy to say that that's not such a radical position anymore. The last reliable poll that I found was taken back in 2009. Back then it showed that only around 40% of American Christians believed that Satan was a real entity. Most of the people who responded to that survey thought that the devil or Satan was simply a symbol of evil. There's some other surveys they take, and they have the numbers maybe up closer to 50% of the people believing that Satan was real. Whatever. The numbers are going down. It's clearly changing. So it seems like we're preaching to the choir these days. Mission accomplished. So now what we have to do is to explain how is it that bad things happen and people suffer if there's only supposed to be absolute good everywhere present. That's the conundrum it raises. No problem, right? Wrong. Big problem, actually. And I think the problem is the word good. Good is a human concept. We use the word good, we define it according to the way that we feel about something. If we like it, if it feels good or feels pleasurable, if it causes no harm, then we call it good. Or we use the word good to describe desirable human behavior, ethical and moral behavior. And it all refers back to how we view the world and our relationships. But are we justified? Are we justified in imposing that definition on the universe, on all of reality, on God? Is the universe good according to human standards? Is reality good according to human standards? Or do we need to stop trying to force the universe and force reality to conform to our needs and desires? We're up to something big here, and that's what we're looking at. And we're going to continue next week. See you then.